with Gilligan, the skipper too, the millionaire and his wife, the movie star, and the rest.
And now,
when I started receiving requests for albums to check out, as you might imagine, I received quite a few more than I could reasonably get to in one 24-episode season. Now, I could have just completely ignored the other suggestions, but that didn't seem fair. So instead, I listened to each of the others exactly once and wrote down my thoughts. And please remember, these are my first impressions, so what you're hearing is my unfiltered, free associations combined with my attempts to be funny. Nothing I say is intended to be insulting to the artist or the people who recommended the album to me. This will be longer than a normal show, but then again, I will be looking at 16 albums. So here we go.
and now,
The only song I knew from Aldo Nova before listening to Subject Aldo Nova was Fantasy. And Fantasy is okay, catchy enough, memorable, more than a little cheesy to my ears. And to be completely fair, the music on Subject Aldo Nova, that style of guitar-heavy hard rock and good time music that came up in the 80s in the wake of Van Halen, wherein lies your Rats, your Cinderellas, your Poisons, and your Bonds Jovi. Apparently there's a way to tell the good ones from the less good ones, but despite the earnest efforts of some very close friends, such discernment is not a skill I possess. Sorry. During my entire spin of Subject Aldo Nova, the only thing that was coming to my mind was direct-to-video B-movies from the 80s. That's how this album feels to me. Like if there was a movie about a troubled teen dude who was doing bad in school and getting beat up all the time because his father left when he was very young, but he later finds out it's because his father is a time-traveling bounty hunter when he discovers his own time travel device, which looks suspiciously like a Nintendo Power Glove, so he puts it on and he finds himself in the time travel bounty hunter central office, which looks suspiciously like the atrium of a Marriott, and he meets an old grizzled bounty hunter dude with a sleeveless jean jacket and says he knows his dad, so the kid just follows him around even though the bounty hunter keeps telling him to get lost. And at one point they go to a strip club so that they can add nudity to the warnings on the HBO program guide so that maybe it will get a following among teenage boys. And then there's a bad guy who's a drug dealer and whose acting name and character are all borderline racist. And the bounty hunter finds out where the bad guy's hideout is. And the bounty hunter gets through wave after wave of the bad guy's henchmen before getting shot in the shoulder by the bad guy. So the kid runs over to the bounty hunter's side and the bounty hunter tells him that he's been his dad the whole time. And so the kid shoots the bad guy and saves his dad and then joins the time travel bounty hunter team. This album would sound like that movie's soundtrack. Close, but you forgot the sassy receptionist at the time travel bounty hunter office. You forgot the cute girl that the dude rescues from the drug dealers. And you forgot the annoying computer-generated AI sidekick built into the Power Glove that offers questionably humorous one-liners all throughout the movie. Other than that, though, yeah, that's about the feel of it.
I'm gonna say this once. Don't get in my way.
and now,
I had no clue who Alcuin was going in. It's not a name I think I'd heard before. The first song, the dance, the opening reminds me a lot of Watcher of the Skies from the Foxtrot album by Genesis. There's fuzz on the guitar that sounds cool, and the full horn section is pretty nice. The songs are mostly symphonic type prog, mostly instrumental. There's also a good amount of improvisation throughout the whole album, right? Lots of solos, but not in a full Canterbury-style group improv way, more like a jam band. Only maybe a bit stiffer, because the rhythm section feels pretty set in these sections, like they can only deviate from the groove if the arrangement allows it. The compositional elements are slick, though. The violinist is pretty good, too. Overall, instrumental prog jam. Not bad.
I never ever saw the stars so bright.
and now,
Some people heard it. Someone
I've heard maybe 2 Joan Armatrading songs in my entire life. Never a full album. Listening to Show Some Emotion, the main thing I keep thinking is, This is an artist that was way ahead of her time. In 1977, nobody sounded like this. Today, there are tons of singers that use that same vocal affect. If this album came out right this second, I could see it becoming huge, especially in the neo-soul crowd. The title track is super great. Like, I think I'm going to push for it to show up in a couple of live things I'll be playing this year. The guitar solo in Never Is Too Late gives off some strong Mark Knopfler vibes. Her acoustic guitar playing on Opportunity is slick. Cool album.
And now,
First note of the piano, and I can tell this is later stuff from Count Basie. Probably 70s. Good sound quality. Looking at the credits, there are some folks you'd expect to find on a Count Basie record, like Al Gray on trombone, Eddie Lockjaw Davis on tenor sax, but also some of the other heavies from the jazz world, like Joe Pass on guitar, Benny Carter on alto sax, Clark Terry on trumpet, and Louis Bellson on drums. This is quite the jam. Highlights for me are Doggin' Around, great energy on that one. The tambourine ride on Kansas City Line added a nice touch to the whole slow blues thing too. Overall, swings. Great album.
and now,
This album reminds me of a guy. Oh geez, here we go. It's a guy I picture in my head who represents a certain aspect of music culture. This is a guy that has a ground floor apartment in some picturesque, inexpensive complex in Los Angeles. The kind with a lush green courtyard with palm trees and a bunch of wacky neighbors who all know each other. But this guy is really into a specific kind of guitar culture. Probably plays a Gretsch hollow body with a Bigsby, but could also be a vintage Sunburst Strat or in a pinch a 3-pickup Black Beauty, also with a Bigsby. This guy could tell you the ins and outs of tube amp design all the way down to the year and batch number of preamp tubes you should be using, but he can't read music and in fact knows absolutely nothing about music theory. He's afraid it will corrupt his natural feel. This guy has an extensive collection of jeans and tight black t-shirts, drives a 60s American muscle car, probably convertible, dark hair or full gray, but immaculately cut and styled. And this guy loves cruzados.
and now,
The songwriting says Smithereens or Squeeze, or maybe Kevin Gilbert. Laugh Again reminds me a lot of The Way It Is by the Rembrandts. And I could be wrong, but I think I've heard the song Crashing Lightly before. Is that possible? Most of these are mid-tempo power pop rockers with above average levels of slickness in the songwriting and harmonic vocabulary. And the guitar solo in Symptoms is fairly impressive. Yeah, I mean, kind of an oversaturated space, but not bad.
and now,
An hour filled with portent and bombast. To quote from the album, "Where are all the joys of yesterday? Where now is the happiness and the laughter that we shared?" Is he gonna be okay? This album is Peter Hamill experiencing an existential crisis for an hour. And judging by his vocal choices, he seems to be pretty pissed about it. But there is good symphonic prog going on around him while it's happening. Still not recommended for times when you might be going through something yourself.
There is some sort of a harmony. It is the harmony of overwhelming and collective murder.
and now,
Yo ho, all hands, hoist the colors high. And yes, that's colors with a U. You know that short form video sharing service we all seem to be using these days, but deep down we all fear that a foreign power is using it to search for exploitable weaknesses in our society? Well, that don't exactly narrow it down, Jim. Well, there are a number of videos on that service that directly relate to the North Sea, namely cargo ships on the North Sea during intense storms. It's freaking terrifying. Stormwatch by Jethro Tull would go perfectly with those videos. Also, I always find it interesting to hear Ian Anderson sing ballads. His vocal affect is so grandiose, so when he's singing these quiet and contemplative songs, it stands out for me. There's certainly really good music on Stormwatch, just very shanty-y.
Yo ho, all have.
And now,
What was happening?
Some huge names on this one, kind of a throwback to the heyday of the LA scene. Lee Sklar on bass, Grant Geisman on guitar, Van Dyke Parks producing, arranging the orchestral parts, and playing accordion. Steve Albini engineering. Initially, I'm reminded of hearing Bjork for the first time on her debut solo album. I wasn't cool enough back in the day to be up on the sugar cubes. But for sure, this is the first harp-fronted progressive neo-indie madrigal folk album I've ever heard. That's harp as in string harp, not harmonica. I mean, you can't swing a dead cat these days without hitting a harmonica-fronted progressive indie neo-madrigal folk album. Am I right? There's a certain innocent charm to the little pentatonic sing-song melodies for these songs. Like she's singing to herself, right? Making up adventures for her toys. But beneath that is a real depth of detached guardedness. Fascinating album. Plus, she was awesome in Inherent Vice.
I miss those days. I miss you.
and now,
I think the NRBQ album Scraps might be my all-time favorite album I've discovered as a result of this show. That or This Close by Janet Fetter from earlier this season. Boy, did that one kill me dead. But things being what they are, I still haven't taken the time to dig deeper into the NRBQ discography. Wild Weekend has a lot of the playfulness, quirk, and joy that I loved about Scraps. Plus, some of the things Al Anderson does on this album are just lethal. Boy, that feller can sure play a Telecaster. But for all of that, Wild Weekend does feel dated. Listening to it, definitely I get a, oh yeah, that's what NRBQ would sound like in the 80s kind of a vibe. Still pretty dang great.
and now,
I like this one quite a bit. First of all, fuzz bass, as you will recall, is never not cool. What this album feels like to me, for the most part, is a group of very skilled musicians playing with ideas instead of songwriters coming in with fully formed songy songs with set accompaniment. Although on one of the later tracks, I think it's Wrong, it sure felt like the piano player was doing everything they could to confuse the bass player while he was improvising. So in that regard, it reminds me of one of my favorite albums of the early 90s. Transmutation, parentheses, Mutatis Mutandis, close parentheses, by Praxis.
and now,
I had no idea when I arranged these albums alphabetically that I had ended up putting a Phil Manzanera solo project right before a Roxy Music album. True randomness is clumpy. Before this, the only Roxy music I knew was Avalon and Country Life. And all the Roxy Music fans that I know have told me that there are way better albums out there. And while most of the album was the same kind of blend of Bat Out of Hell / Hedwig and the Angry Inch style 70s glam that I'd heard on the other albums, there were a couple of tracks that really brought out a serious vibe. The Bogus Man in particular. Much like Sister Ray from White Light, White Heat, I found myself just enjoying the self-sustaining sonic landscape that they had created with that song. Still not much of a fan of Brian Ferry's vocal choices. Sorry.
and now,
Slick and shiny, immaculately produced grooves, hyper-intelligent disco-y, housey vibes, but much more chill. Not too far off from Krungbin, only with layered vocals and more instruments. It's the kind of album that makes you search for Nile Rodgers in the credits, especially the song C'est si bon. Strong mid-70s Nile Rodgers vibes coming from that one. This is music for your Studio 54 themed dinner party.
And now,
This is a very religious album. Christian. This is a very Christian album, but like Protestant Christian. This is a very 70s white American middle-class Protestant Christian album. I'm going to stick to just the music, but please keep in mind, quite Christian. Musically, what I hear is some late 60s LA scene Laurel Canyon style folk rock, some Starland vocal band, sometimes ABBA, and sometimes it's the Ray Conniff singers. Occasional glimpses of clever songwriting, certainly very polished and well performed. You know, I can see really getting into this album if you're living in a house where you had to listen to it on the regular.
Jesus is a friend of mine. Jesus is my friend.
and now,
Just from the name, I was expecting a work of experimental electronic music along the lines of like Silver Apples of the Moon by Morton Subotnick, which is cool. I love that stuff. And when the album started with a sequenced Moog figure, I assumed that's what we were in for. But that assumption was quickly corrected. Most of the album is one giant suite and reminded me a lot of Happy the Man. Complex, but occasionally tongue-in-cheek prog. I'm going to have to listen to this one a bunch more, I think. And for some reason, the Wikipedia page for Sigmund Snopek III doesn't list this album. Fascinating music overall.
Say howdy to Western Smile. Come out to Roy Rogers and say howdy to fresh food.
and now,
I always thought it would be hilarious to put an album on by a band called Throbbing Gristle, and what you hear is like Muskrat Love. I've been a fan of Throbbing Gristle for a while. Well, in the way that one can be a fan. This is all pretty conceptual stuff. But I hadn't heard this one before. And if you've never heard them before, Throbbing Gristle is avant-garde electronica and noise. Very much along the lines of The Residents or the more experimental Kraftwerk recordings. And honestly, I don't dip into this style of music all that often. Not because I don't appreciate it, but much like the movies of Jan Svankmajer or the novels of John Brunner, I need to get myself into a specific kind of headspace first. But if you're ever hosting a party and you want to thin the crowd out to just the cool kids, 20 jazz funk greats will do the trick.
and now,
And that's the lot. I'm guessing you can probably see why I like to spend a little bit more time with each album than just a single spin. I want to thank all of you who sent your suggestions to me, and especially to those of you who took time out of your life to talk with me about the albums that you suggested. I couldn't have made this season without the lot of you. Season 5 information is coming soon. Until then, so long.